All right, welcome to Maximus Live, episode 42. Special shout out to all the folks who are joining us on Discord, the original source of our weekly call-in radio show. Shout out to Estevan on Instagram Live and Alva on Instagram Live, and the many folks who are joining us today on Clubhouse through the Human Behavior Club. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, my name is Dr. Cam Sapa. I'm a clinical psychologist and psychiatry professor, and I'm also the CEO of Maximus. You can check us out at maximistribe.com. I have an expertise in men's health and hormone optimization, which is what our company does. We provide at-home doctor-prescribed labs and medications that can safely and effectively double your testosterone levels. So every Thursday at 6 o'clock, although we're doing it this week on Wednesday, we host a call-in radio show where you can call in and get coached about any questions that have to do with health. So I answer any questions about hormone optimization, but also just health optimization in general in terms of optimizing your diet, your exercise, your sleep, your focus, and your relationships. So we like to start out every single week with a weekly unpopular opinion, and then I take questions from the audience that if you have any questions about your health. All right, so this week's unpopular opinion is one of the biggest impediments to hormonal health is surprisingly plastics, and specifically something called microplastics. So people know that the oceans are polluted, but I think people fail to understand, quite frankly, how polluted our oceans and our environments have become. So by the year 2025, we have so much plastic in the ocean that basically for every 3 tons of fish that are in the ocean, there's a ton of plastic that is floating around. And the reason that's a big deal is because these plastics, if you can imagine like a plastic bag or those like rings on a 6-pack of soda, they get broken down as they float around in the ocean and turn into what are called microplastics and even nanoplastics when they break down into very small particle sizes. And what ends up happening is these are literally consumed by the sea life out there. So ironically, if you are a fan of eating shellfish, I love eating shrimp. You actually, unfortunately, because we eat shellfish whole, including their digestive tract, there's a bunch of plastics that they've swallowed, which we thus swallow when we eat shrimp and other shellfish. And so, unfortunately, that's a huge source of microplastics. So, if you think they've actually done studies and research in terms of how much we actually end up consuming. So, if you consume shellfish, you eat probably 182 particles, basically, or pieces of microplastics just from shellfish. You probably get 10 particles of microplastics from beer a week, 11 microplastics from salt. But by far, actually, the biggest source of microplastics is drinking water. So the average person consumes 1,769 particles of plastic from tap and bottled water in particular. And so it's by far, unfortunately, our water, which originates from the oceans, lakes, streams, etc. And even though it is filtered by the municipal water supply, is essentially heavily polluted. So when they've sampled tap water in the United States, 94.4% of tap water actually contains plastic fibers. And if you take an average sample of water, so about, let's say 500 milliliters or about 17 ounces of water, there's basically 4.8 pieces of plastic literally in 2 cups of water that you consume. And so what's the danger of all these plastics? Given this is a show about testosterone, it's a huge impediment to your hormonal health. The ingestion of microplastics often contains what are called xenoestrogens, or basically these artificial or synthetic estrogens, which to a guy, they accumulate and they disrupt your hormonal process and your testosterone production. So the number one tip is you should really try to drink filtered water, because the greater the filtration process, the more it reduces these microplastics. So if you use a simple Brita filter or basically a carbon-based filter, it'll do a decent job of removing these microplastics, but the highest gold standard is what's called reverse osmosis water, in which it's gone through a multi-step and very fine grain filtration process that gets most of the microplastics out. You can always add a couple drops of mineral concentrate if you want to restore the minerals that may be reduced, or obviously you can supplement them separately. But when I talk to leading scientific experts, like the CEO of Million Marker, who's a company that actually tests your urine samples for the presence of these endocrine disrupting chemicals that come from microplastics, they really recommend reverse osmosis filtered water as the best way of reducing microplastics from your daily ingestion. And this is a crazy fact, but this is actually a fact that I got from a report that was published by the University of Newcastle, Australia. So for those of you who think, oh, okay, like who cares about a few shreds or shards of plastic, that I'm getting in my water or my food? Their estimation is that the average person is actually consuming 5 grams of plastic a week, which is basically the equivalent of one credit card, right? So if you're listening to this and saying, oh, who cares about plastics? Would you voluntarily eat a credit card every week? I think most people in their right minds would obviously not do that, but we are basically accidentally or inadvertently consuming a credit card size worth of plastic every single week through our food and beverage, mostly through our drinking water. And so obviously if you care about your health and care about not polluting your body with these microplastics and nanoplastics, make sure you're getting very high quality filtered water. Another very helpful tip is to be careful about the use of plastics, particularly in cooking or boiling water. So if you remember like cheap like Lipton bag tea, it's just a paper bag, it's a staple and a cotton thread that you use to dip the tea. These new premium tea bags are actually plastic. If you've ever seen those pyramidal shaped tea bags, even though they're supposed to be fancier and higher grade, they're literally made out of plastic. And in fact, there was a study that was published in 2019 in the Journal of Environmental Science Technology that looked at what happens when you steep a plastic tea bag in hot water at 95 degrees Celsius, or about just under boiling, to about 200 degrees Fahrenheit. It releases 11.6 billion with a B, microplastics, and 3.1 billion with a B, nanoplastics in a single cup of beverage. Now, these are tiny particle sizes, right? These microplastics are 100 micromolars versus 1,000 micromolars for the nanomolars, I should say, for the nanoplastics. But basically, you wouldn't believe that literally steeping one plastic tea bag in a cup of water releases in total 14.7 billion pieces of tiny, like under a microscope size bits of plastic. And you are obviously ingesting that when you consume your cup of tea, which most people actually associate with health. And yes, tea itself may be healthy, although ironically you shouldn't consume very large quantities of tea because of the fluoride content. But you're actually consuming a lot of it, not from the tea, but the tea bag itself. So it's not to encourage people to be OCD or like an excessively hypervigilant, but I think, it's obviously not a smart idea to boil plastic and ingest that water. And so it's the same thing too. Bottled water, because it's been sitting in plastic, gets contaminated, and cooking things in plastic containers is obviously not a great idea. If at all possible, use glass or Pyrex cooking ware, ceramic, things that don't contain any plastic or any like plastic-like coatings, like Teflon, for instance. In which you might get microplastics that way. So easy and effective tip is you drink filtered water and avoid plastics in the things that you drink and cook in order to reduce the amount of microplastics that you are ingesting into your system. All right, so that's this week's unpopular opinion. I'm going to start opening up the audience and bring up people up on the platform if you want to ask questions about your health or hormones in general. Ali, let me know if you got a question on Clubhouse. And if not, we got a bunch of questions from the audience that I can take. Hi, Dr. Eileen. Do you have a question?
Yes, I just wanted to know if you can translate the 5 gram plastic, microplastic that everybody consumes in average every week. How does that translate to the lowering of testosterone level?
Yeah, I don't
Thank
know
you.
if there's a proportionate calculation or translation that like if you consume per 1 gram that you consume how much it drops testosterone. Unfortunately, it's not ethical to do that research because you'd have to feed people plastics on purpose, which I think would be have a very hard time getting through an IRB. But we do know epidemiologically, although this is associational data, so we should take it with a big grain of salt. There's been a pretty significant decrease in testosterone levels and sperm count over the last 50 years. So total testosterone's dropped 50%. Bioavailable testosterone's dropped 65% over the last 50 years. Sperm count has dropped 50% over the last 50 years. And if you talk to leading experts, like for instance, I had Dr. Jim Hoatling on our podcast last week. In his opinion, these microplastics and endocrine disrupting chemicals that come from sources like microplastics are probably the primary contributor to it. So if basically testosterone and sperm count have dropped in half by the last 50 years, it may be that these microplastics, which probably didn't exist in nearly the similar quantities as they do now. So I don't think people were consuming 5 grams of microplastics 50 years ago. Is probably responsible for it. So, very general rule of thumb. So, maybe cutting it in half, the amount that we're consuming compared to the amount, at least, let's say our fathers or grandfathers were consuming about 50 years ago.
Thank you.
All right, about a few former folks up on the audience. Let me know if you have any questions.
Yeah, Dr. Cameron, my name is Ray. I had a quick question, but my question is about soaps.
Mm-hmm.
I also heard that there are certain types of soaps that are in the market which are really not good for men in terms of, some soaps are really harmful and it may have an impact to I don't know if it has an impact to the extent of impacting testosterone in men. Would you happen to know anything more or throw some light on what kind of soaps should we be using or not using?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the question is around, what kind of soaps should men be using, and are there particular soaps to avoid that may be having some of these endocrine disrupting chemicals that are mentioned? I don't know about particular research on soaps, so this is going to be a little bit more of a generalization. I think ironically, like if you think about how we should treat food or ultra processed food, there's a clear trend or association between the less processed the food it is, the healthier it is for us, right? In the sense that, food that's just one ingredient essentially doesn't have a nutritional label, right? So if you go around the periphery of the grocery store, meat, fruit, and vegetables don't have nutritional labels because when you buy a banana, you know exactly what's in it. There's no nutritional label needed. Once you start eating minimally processed food, let's say yogurt, which is something that you can make at home. I think it's just like, milk or cream and bacterial culture. It'll have 2, maybe 3 ingredients in it. Obviously, once you start consuming ultra processed food, like a Cheeto, it'll have 20 ingredients, much of which have very chemical sounding names that you probably don't recognize and is probably not very good for you. I would argue it's the same for soaps and other cosmetic products that are used on the skin. You should basically consider, that your skin is the largest organ of your body, and it's very absorbing. In fact, there are, drug delivery patches that are literally absorbed through the skin. There's, in fact, like pain relieving patches and things like that, which are formulated in a way that it does get absorbed. So you should assume that anything that you put on your skin to at least some possible degree may be absorbed. It just depends on how it's formulated. And I think soaps are no exception to that. So my general rule of thumb would be buy soaps in which they're just like the food. There's a minimal amount of ingredients. So for instance, if you buy, I generally think like a pure Castile soap is minimally processed. Soap has been obviously been made for thousands of years. It's a chemical reaction that's commonly done with some sort of a fat and lye, typically speaking. And Castile soaps will generally just have, the saponified remnants of that reaction, which are typically like glycerin. Usually the soaps that retain the glycerin will have that as an ingredient. They usually use some sort of vegetable oil or fat. So like for instance, like a coconut oil might be the base of the soap. And then they may add some, natural fragrance, some whatever it is that you like, lavender, peppermint, etc. But if you look at like, for instance, like a Dr. Bronner's, that's like the most common example of a Castile soap. It'll usually have those like 1 to 3 ingredients. And so it's a minimally processed soap. Similar with like, handmade kind of soaps that you'd buy at like an Etsy or like a Whole Foods. Obviously just look at the ingredients. If it's clear and straightforward and they're minimally processed and they use more natural ingredients, especially natural scents and things like that, it's probably going to be better for you than a lot of, especially these body washes. I think a lot of these body washes that are sold kind of like shampoos, and ironically they're marketed a lot more towards men these days. Like men, the Dove, for instance, has a whole men's line now that's colored darkly and in black bottles to make it seem more manlier. But yeah, the ingredients are multiple ingredients, highly complex, highly chemical sounding names, and we can't say for sure that it decreases testosterone and causes hormonal disruption. But like I said, as a speculation based on what we know from the processing of foods, you're probably ingesting those chemicals as well. So on the basis of that, I ironically like use the soap that your grandpa used would probably be a good rule of thumb. In that handmade bar soaps or very simple sort of Castile soaps are good ways of going about it. I think I personally use a very simple Castile soap that has tea tree oil, which has some natural antibacterial qualities. And I think it's organic. I'll find the name of it. It's like Desert Essence or something. You can get it on Amazon. And it probably has like some version of it at Trader Joe's as well. But that's the rules of thumb that I would use to buy soaps. Minimal ingredients, minimal processing.
Got it. Thank you for that. Yeah, I think I first heard about the impact of soap. I just overheard about this new book. I think it's not new or anything. It's like 5 years old. There is a book called Estra Generation.
That's right.
And I have not read the book, but I have a colleague of mine mention about it. And also, what caught my attention was the use of soaps and stuff like that. So I said, oh, okay. I mean, apart from the other chemicals that you just mentioned about use of plastics and things like that, I didn't think about the soap angle to it. So
yeah,
that's the question.
And like I said, it's not to make everyone paranoid about all the things, but we should be conscious is the way that I put it, or mindful maybe is a good word, right? If it's something that you're using every day, and soap is in that category, right? Your soap, your facial cleanser, your lotion, if it's something that you're literally using every single day for a good portion of your life, yeah, do a little bit of research, because you're going to accumulate that over time. It's different if you're like, oh, okay, I don't know, I'm having this ice cream bar. It has like 10 ingredients, and this is a treat every once in a while. You don't get the sort of the damage of the accumulation over time. So I think about it the same way. I don't want to be like hyper researching every single purchasing decision that I make in my life. Life is too short, and ain't nobody got time for that, as the meme says. But it's like the same thing. I did research on the soap that I use. I use the same soap to wash my hands as body wash. Use it on my dishes because it's just high quality soap, and I consider it relatively safe. And then I use it for everything. And now I don't have to think about that decision on a regular basis. I just buy it in bulk and reuse the same stuff. So I do share that in the sense of, especially because I have a whole background in treating anxiety disorders. It's not to encourage anxiety. It's just to help you make better decisions in terms of what you're putting in your body, and that is going to provide a long-term benefit with you without making you a hypochondriac.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I appreciate your thoughts on that. It also reminded me about the chemicals and the plastic bottles. What is your impression on the use of the water pitchers like Brita, other filters?
Yeah, as I mentioned, they're helpful for removing microplastics. Unfortunately, they're made out of plastic themselves, and it's almost completely unavoidable. I actually have a glass pitcher that I use, so the water that sits in it is sitting in glass to reduce the contact with plastic. But the filter itself is made out of plastic, right? I've never seen a filter that's not, as far as I know, because even though it's running through carbon, the tube that it has to go through is plastic. So you can't avoid it altogether, but what I can do is, like I said, you're trying to minimize the contact or the impact. So that's the trade-off that I have. I do think it's better to run it through a Brita filter than to just drink plain tap water. Tap water is safe, like there have like standards in terms of like you're not going to get sick from drinking tap water, at least in the United States and Europe. Can't say the same, unfortunately, for some other countries, but they're not incorporating these microplastics in terms of their safety assessment, right? Because someone doesn't get sick from eating microplastics. It's the slow accumulation of that over time that may cause problems down the road, and it's hard to know. Oh, is it because I was drinking tap water that I developed, endocrine problems, or have half the testosterone that my grandfather does? Nobody knows, right? So I do think it's a good idea to filter your water, but like I said, reverse osmosis is even better, and there's better quality filters even than Brita as well if you kind of do your research.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yes, Vic.
Victor, just interesting. Don't you think that Western countries running on sugar lately, and as introduction of sugary diet, the testosterone went down? Don't you think there is a connection?
Yes. So it's a great question about what's the association of nutrition and hormones. So we do know that obesity and metabolic syndrome are a factor in the decline of testosterone. So, I was talking a lot about endocrine disrupting chemicals and microplastics, but obesity and metabolic syndrome has skyrocketed, right? 70% of Americans are overweight or obese. 88% have some sort of metabolic dysregulation, including high blood pressure, high blood sugar, dyslipidemia, etc. And so if you're consuming enough sugar that it's causing you to be overweight, accumulate excess what's called central adiposity, or basically belly fat, that's kind of like the beer belly or the tire around the belly that guys tend to accumulate, then that can absolutely harm your hormones. So it's one of these things in pharmacology. We talk about this phrase, the dose makes the poison. So a little bit of sugar is not going to disrupt your testosterone terribly. I don't know anyone who consumes zero, but it is a matter of amount, which is, it kind of depends on your carbohydrate tolerance. If you're obviously on the diabetes spectrum, sugar is going to affect you more. It's going to induce more of a glucose spike and an insulin spike, which results in greater storage of that as body fat, especially if you're consuming a caloric excess. So if you're consuming too much sugar, especially added sugar, highly refined carbohydrates, and it's making you fat or increasing your blood sugar in particular, then yes, it can disrupt, your hormones. In addition to that, the types of foods, ironically, that have a lot of added sugar are exactly the ultra-processed foods that I was talking about earlier, right? So we're not talking about the natural fruit sugars that you get when you eat a Granny Smith apple, right? We're talking about, like, if you're buying a processed cookie in the supermarket that clearly has added sugar, it also is sitting in a plastic container. It's been highly processed by equipment that's probably plastic and has a higher likelihood of having those microplastics that we talked about when you're eating your, Chips Ahoy or your Oreo cookies. Those, in addition to the added sugar and the problems of that, also is more likely to have endocrine disrupting chemicals, and microplastics that we discussed. So it's kind of a 2-for-1 double whammy, if you will. It's the sugar and the negative things that tend to come with sugary foods that can be disruptive to your hormones. So I do think it is a very helpful rule of thumb for most guys to try to cut out as much added sugar and refined carbohydrates in their diet as possible, because it really doesn't provide us very much benefit. Now, the natural sugar that you obviously get from the consumption of fruit and whole foods is a different story, and can be absolutely eaten in moderation, like I said, up to your carbohydrate tolerance, meaning that if you're able to consume it and burn it, most importantly, like if you're doing a lot of physical activity, you're doing a lot of walking, you're doing a lot of sports, you can consume more carbohydrates because you're burning them as fuel. But if you're not, and you're eating excess calories and it's obviously going to your waist, then you want to minimize the amount of carbohydrates. Unfortunately, most American diets have an excess of carbohydrates and a deficiency in protein. And so we're consuming more and more food because we're almost starved for protein in order to maintain our muscle mass and our lean body mass. But we're really just consuming more and more carbohydrates along the way, particularly the bad kind, as I mentioned, the added sugars and refined carbohydrates that we're trying to avoid. And so that's what I would say in terms of, yes, nutrition does make a big difference in terms of our hormone status, and we should absolutely try to eat as much unprocessed food as possible, which reduces chronic inflammation in our body that disrupts our hormone status. But the interesting thing is, when they look at these studies, even when they statistically control for obesity, testosterone is still going down, which means it's not just our diet that's contributing to the testosterone epidemic. It does seem to be that these microplastics and endocrine disrupting chemicals are having an effect above and beyond just us getting fat, because we see this effect, in fact, in very healthy, skinny young males as well, right? These guys are not overweight, but their hormone levels are less than, like I said, their fathers and their grandfathers, because they're polluted a lot more than they were. So even though they're eating a very clean diet, their hormones are still being affected by the contamination essentially that's happening. So I think the take-home message is you gotta cover both bases, right? Stay away from excess plastics, don't touch receipts, filter your drinking water. At the same time, yes, cut out excess added sugars and refined carbohydrates, and do both approaches in order to make sure that your hormones and your health are as optimal as possible.
Hi, Cameron. My name is Vanessa. I'm new to this platform, so I just want to say bear with me on what I missed and things like that. But
no worries.
Thank you for putting forth this research. And a little anecdote for me, I personally am passionate about water because my grandfather in Ontario here developed a company that was sued by the government for claiming our city water wasn't so good.
Yeah.
So my family has been quite water conscious growing up. But moving forward from that, essentially my thoughts, and piggybacking off of what you were just talking about in terms of hormone status and this reduction in testosterone over time from our grandparents and in our history, I was thinking about the context of the sex differentiation process when, a woman is developing a baby in utero.
Right.
And the importance of, I just learned this. I just thought kind of XY chromosome, right, was the key genetic piece, but then later on learning the importance of hormones to complete the process,
right,
the sex differentiation process, and creating, variations in our genders, arguably. So, do you know of any studies, perhaps, linked to that perspective?
Yeah. So, in addition, I mentioned to the testosterone epidemic or decline that we're seeing, the other huge issue is the fertility epidemic that we're seeing. And women, unfortunately, are unfairly blamed, I think, for a lot of infertility issues, because a lot of times the issue can actually originate in men. As I mentioned, sperm counts have gone down 50% in the last 50 years as well, which obviously has a huge impact on fertility. So to your point, testosterone levels have dropped precipitously, and some of those effects are actually happening in utero, meaning while the pregnancy is happening, and that extends into adulthood. So one of the really interesting things, and this actually came out of, if you're curious, there's an article that GQ did, and I know like GQ is not the highlight of like scientific evidence, but they actually interviewed some of the world's experts on hormones and talked about this concept of sperm count zero, which is if this decline in sperm count keeps continuing. I think by 2045, they estimate that we'll basically hit sperm count zero as a species, be unable to reproduce. Now, I don't think that's actually going to happen because I think there'll still be some guys who will be fertile. So maybe, I don't know, they'll hoard the resources as well. But it's a disturbing trend, right? And obviously, I don't think anyone knows when it's going to level out or if it's going to improve or what's going to happen. But the decrease is obviously not good news. So one of the things that they mentioned specifically in this article is that there's a marker of sex, and it's called the anogenital distance. And it's the measurement between the anus and the genitals. Now, in men, the AGD, or the anogenital distance, is typically twice the length of a woman's. And it's actually a bigger, more dramatic difference between men and women than height, than weight, or how much muscle they have, which is typically what you think about the differences between men and women. But here's the interesting thing. It's a good proxy for testosterone. So when you have low testosterone in utero, it leads to a shorter AGD. And if you have a shorter AGD, that correlates with a guy being 7 times as likely to be subfertile or less fertile. And it has greater likelihood of having undescended testicles, testicular tumors, and literally a smaller penis. So the interesting thing is when guys are producing less sperm, it's not just that the sperm that they're producing, but if you look at babies that are birthed now compared to babies that were birthed 50 years ago, the anogenital distance of these babies are shrinking, meaning that literally baby boys are becoming less male, right? They're becoming more like women. So it's this fascinating thing that we can literally measure it, right? With like a tape measure when these babies are coming out of the womb. And we're seeing this phenomenon happen. It's very physical and real. We're not talking about a blood marker even like testosterone. So it's very disturbing, quite honestly, that we're seeing this phenomenon. It's like a physical change that we can literally see tangibly and measure. So
Thank you for sharing that piece. It's totally new information for me. So I hope I'm not cutting you off.
Nope, go ahead.
So I wanted to then follow up with, so currently I've been drinking, my distillation process is actually buying distilled water from plastic containers.
Mm-hmm.
So is this really helpful?
In what regard?
So I'm avoiding plastics,
right,
ideally, and I'm drinking distilled water from a plastic container.
Yeah, I mean, the use of distilled water in particular, I think there's a utility for distilled water in certain applications. So, for instance, if you use a neti pot, if people are familiar with neti pots, usually a neti pot is like a nasal rinse that people do. It's very helpful if you kind of have like sinus issues or you get kind of congested or clogged up. That you should absolutely use distilled water. So if you're not familiar, for the people who are listening, distilled water is basically water that's boiled, and so it's purified and is bottled immediately, so it's not contaminated. So it has very little amounts of bacteria in it.
You know, after that, for information, distilled water is actually the water that's the evaporation. The evaporation water is the most purified water, and that is the water that's kept. Is that helpful?
Yeah. It's usually through steam distillation, right? So it's boiled and then the heating and condensation. So yes, technically, but it's essentially the same thing. But yeah, I think for applications like that, they always recommend using distilled water. Unfortunately, there's like brain amoebas that you can get if you use tap water. It's absolutely critical to use distilled water. In terms of your drinking water, you can obviously use distilled water, but I think the main importance is to use physical filtration processes, because just the boiling or the distillation won't necessarily remove the microplastics that I mentioned.
I thought it would. Okay, thank you.
Yep, absolutely. Delma, do you have a question? All right. If there's other folks who want to come up and ask questions, I got a question today from one of our community members on Discord. I'll read this one. So Diego today asked, why do vitamin D levels in your body drop? What recommendations can you give regarding using apps such as D-Minder, which helps you estimate your vitamin D production? So I'll answer this question kind of in a broader way. So vitamin D is also a hormone, just like testosterone is a hormone, as we mentioned. I always kind of joke we shouldn't call it vitamin D. We should call it hormone D. And it's a hormone that's naturally produced. We can consume it in the food that we eat. So there's fish that are high in vitamin D. Shellfish like oysters that I mentioned also high in vitamin D. But most of the vitamin D that we produce is through our body's process when we get sunshine that shines upon our skin. Unfortunately, to ask your question about why do vitamin D levels drop, number one, we're indoors most of the time, and so we're not getting natural vitamin D production just because we're not in the sun enough. And then number two, they do tend to drop seasonally based on obviously how cold the environment is and sun exposure. Naturally, obviously during the winter time, vitamin D levels drop because we just go outside less, but also because the position of the sun has less of the UV rays that are necessary for vitamin D production. So you can actually tell this by using an app that the questioner referred to called D-Minder, like kind of reminder, but spelled D-Minder. You can download it for free. I believe there's a free iOS app. I'm not sure if it's on Android. But the great thing about it is it just pulls your location from your phone's GPS data, and then it'll tell you based on your location and the time of day how much vitamin D are you getting. And I've actually tested this in San Francisco during certain parts of December during the winter. There's like zero vitamin D production that's happening like for a few weeks out of the year. So obviously, naturally, your vitamin D levels are going to drop because even if you are outside, walking around shirtless trying to get some vitamin D, there's just not enough, or you'd have to literally be out for hours to produce as much as getting, let's say, 15 minutes of vitamin D exposure at solar noon during the peak of summer, where you can get like 5,000 IUs of vitamin D in a very short period of time. And so now part of that may be natural and normal. We don't necessarily need to have flat or steady state levels of vitamin D all the time. Just naturally, seasonally, our levels will sort of fluctuate. The thing is, you just don't want it to get too low. I think there's a theory that sort of levels go up higher in the summer, almost as like a protection, knowing that they're going to drop later in the winter. So it's almost like you're storing up for the winter, so to speak. Maybe we accumulate body fat in the same way. Like the availability of berries, for instance, during late summer is like consuming large quantities of that is kind of fattening because maybe there's not enough food for the winter. So it may be the same phenomenon with vitamin D. Vitamin D is a fat soluble vitamin or hormone. And so it takes a few months for levels to kind of stabilize out of your system. So if you've gotten a lot of vitamin D during the summertime, that's not going to disappear overnight just because you go inside and don't go outside. It's literally contained and stored in your own body fat. And so it's a because it's fat soluble, it'll take some time for levels to drop. So as a result of that, I do suggest, two things for people, as we've talked about in previous shows, is number one, try to get as much natural vitamin D production by going outside. First thing in the morning is really important to reset your circadian rhythm and help you sleep by getting sun exposure, particularly in your eyes. And then if you can, take a little walking break during your lunch as close to solar noon as possible, which is very optimal in terms of the amount of vitamin D you're getting for a short period of time. You can get a lot of vitamin D in 15 to 30 minutes, especially around 12, 1 o'clock, depending on the time of year, which is when the sun is highest in the sky. That's solar noon. Will get you natural vitamin D production. Now, the rule of thumb, of course, is never burn yourself because that'll increase your risk of skin cancer. So if you're fair skinned, you might not want to spend a lot of time outside in the sun, or you may need to build up that time from a few minutes to 5 minutes to 10 minutes to 15 minutes as your melanin levels kind of develop a little bit of a base tan and will protect you from being sort of sunburned. I obviously always recommend that you put sunscreen on your face, neck, and especially like the back of your hands. Those are areas that tend to accumulate skin cancer, and they're also, quite frankly, cosmetically or aesthetically, they're the places that people care about the most in terms of signs of aging. And so, your body, that's not a lot of your body area. You should try to get most of your vitamin D from your torso or your legs. And so I think you can protect your face, in particular, your face and neck, from premature aging and sunspots, while getting vitamin D from on the rest of your body. In addition to that, I do recommend vitamin D supplementation. Obviously, consult with your own physician in terms of what's appropriate to you. But the upper limit of recommended intake in the United States is 10,000 IUs of vitamin D. Most people taking approximately 5,000 is a pretty safe dose. Up to 10,000 IUs of vitamin D will help them get into the normal range. Now, that's usually above, I believe, 30 nanograms per deciliter. Up to about 60 is considered optimal. There's no consensus, really, unfortunately, on what is optimal, but I'd say 30 to 60 is a good ballpark range. And even that's a little bit loose. You're probably fine even being at 60 up to 100 nanograms per deciliter. But, they've looked at studies of hunter-gatherers who are just in the sun all the time from living outside. And their hunter-gatherers, at least in Africa, probably have steady state levels of about 45 nanograms per deciliter. I think literally last time I tested myself, I was at 44. So, it's a good number to sort of shoot for. And I take a combination of vitamin D supplements and try to get outside in the sun. And quite frankly, you need both. A lot of people would be surprised. They think they get enough sunshine and their levels are good. I've talked about this on a previous show because I test everything. I live in LA and I get a lot of sunshine, and I'm a guy, so I can walk around without a shirt on. My levels were at, I think, 28 without supplementation, which is below the recommended, range of 30. And so I think really most people, particularly if you live above the San Francisco, Washington, D.C., Athens latitude, you're almost guaranteed to be deficient in vitamin D. And even those of you who are closer to the equator, like me, who lives in LA, unless you're spending a lot of time outside, you're probably also still deficient, or at least non-optimal in vitamin D. So supplementation in conjunction with your physician is likely to be a good idea for most people. All right, other questions? If anyone wants to come up on Clubhouse, feel free to ask. Let's see, we got one person here.
Hey, Cameron.
Hey, Matthew.
Just a quick question. I just got in there, so I'm sorry about that.
No worries.
But you just said that you were to consult with your physician about D vitamins.
Yep.
Is that in testosterone, for testosterone?
The reason I always say consult with your physician is because we're not providing medical advice on this show, and you have to take into account your own, contraindications. So everyone's a little bit different. You may be on some medications. Your doctor might or might not want you on vitamin D, or might want you on a different dose than what I suggested. So that's why I always think it's important to consult with your physician to make sure you figure out what's right for you. Now, as to your question about what's the relationship between vitamin D and testosterone, there's a lot of research on it, but unfortunately the results are very mixed in terms of, does vitamin D supplementation increase testosterone? Honestly, the evidence is it's unclear. However, I think my interpretation of the literature as a scientist is that it seems to be, if you're deficient in vitamin D, meaning you're below that kind of 30 nanograms per deciliter, if I'm getting the units correct, then supplementation may be helpful, right? Because if you have a vitamin D deficiency, it's involved in your overall hormone production, including possibly testosterone as well. So if you're below the normal range for vitamin D, taking a supplement may in fact increase your testosterone to where it should have been if your vitamin D levels are healthy. Now, if you're within the normal range, between let's say 30 and 60, then it's unclear whether vitamin D supplementation is going to give you an additional testosterone increase or boost. It may not. The studies are quite frankly mixed. So I don't think vitamin D is a testosterone boosting strategy in and of itself. Don't think that just because you're going to take a vitamin D supplement, your testosterone is going to magically skyrocket. Really, it's not. It's really just going to go to where it should have been if you were deficient in the first place. And if you're normal, it's probably not going to do much for your testosterone. It'll do other beneficial things. There's a lot of benefits to vitamin D. So first of all, for immunity, it's absolutely critical, especially in this era of COVID. We do know there's a very strong association between vitamin D status and the likelihood of getting COVID, and particularly the severity of COVID in terms of whether you require a hospitalization or not. There's clear associations in terms of COVID prognosis in terms of how the course of the illness progresses and whether you're deficient in vitamin D. Those people who are deficient in vitamin D are much more likely to get hospitalized, much more likely to die from COVID versus those who are not. I think it's actually, again, consult with your doctor, but for most people, it's a pretty smart strategy, I would believe, to have optimal vitamin D levels, whether through supplementation and or sunshine, to make sure that you don't get COVID, and if you do, you're going to be able to have the immune system that can fight it and survive it. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, there are certain parts of the world where they're literally handing out vitamin D for free as a COVID prevention strategy. So I think vitamin D is absolutely critical for immune health, not just for endocrine health in terms of hormones. Second thing it's really particularly important for is mood. Vitamin D also being sort of a mood regulating hormone, particularly in folks who struggle with depression, seems to be beneficial. Now, again, it's not an antidepressant per se, and it's not going to be a panacea for everyone with depression. But if you're deficient, again, in vitamin D, and you see this phenomenon, for instance, in people who have what's called seasonal affective disorder or SAD, so in the wintertime, that's when their depression comes. It may be associated with the drop in vitamin D that's happening because they're not getting, obviously, as much sunshine and the particular UV rays that produce vitamin D during the winter time. So vitamin D, I think, is also very important for regulating a positive, happy mood. And the other thing is it can be very helpful for stress, right? If you have sufficient vitamin D levels, it helps the regulation of cortisol levels, helps manage your stress levels. And so vitamin D is just very important overall, not only for testosterone and hormonal health, but your immunity, your mood, and your stress. So it has multifactorial effects and is really critical, I think, to just your overall health. So it's important.
That is a great answer, Cameron. And I know, what you just said is quite crucial for people. I reside in Oslo, Norway, and times get, it's cold, and it's deficiency in vitamin D, serum's 25 hydroxy vitamin D is, it's common in Europe and the Middle East.
Right.
And I remember, I think it occurs in less than 20% in Northern Europe, but but it says that in 30 to 60% in Western, Southern, and Eastern Europe, and up to actually 80% in Middle Eastern countries, it's a vitamin D deficiency. So it's vital information that you're giving. So thank you, brother. That's cool.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is also, I always tell people, I think it's very useful to test vitamin D levels as part of your annual physical. Ask your doctor to get your vitamin D levels checked because, like I said, almost everyone's deficient. And also it'll help you figure out what the right dosage is for you. If you're getting a lot of sunlight and you're getting some vitamin D through sun and food, you may not need as much of a dose. Versus if you're almost getting none from exogenous sources, you may need to take a higher dose of vitamin D. And that's why it's useful to test sort of before and after to make sure that you're getting your levels to where they need to be. I can tell you anecdotally, we actually did a validation study as part of our company. So as I mentioned, I have a company separate from this. It's at maximustribe.com that does hormone optimization. And so as part of our validation study, we were measuring testosterone, estrogen, and vitamin D levels. The interesting thing is these are all men who lived in Los Angeles, right? So very far away from Norway, much lower latitude, a lot of sunshine here. You wouldn't think a lot of these folks would be vitamin D deficient, but almost everyone, surprisingly, was definitely not optimal in vitamin D. Not everyone was deficient per se, but I would say levels are pretty low. A lot of guys in like the 10s, in the 20s, and even the folks who were not technically deficient, they were like in the 30s, so they're even on the low end of normal. I think I was the only person that was like nowhere near deficient, and I think at the time is because I was taking a supplement, so my levels were like in the 70s. It was clearly obvious that I was taking supplements because I was way higher. I was like twice as high, quite frankly, in terms of vitamin D than everyone else who was not taking a supplement. So it does seem to make a difference, and testing, your levels will help you just make sure that you're getting the right amount, of vitamin D. So I think it's really, really important. I think, a lot of guys walk around and they're like, my mood's not good. My stress levels are high. I get sick. I get a lot of colds, upper respiratory infections frequently. I don't really know what's right, what's wrong. And it's not saying it's absolutely one reason, but vitamin D deficiency can be a contributing factor. And it's such an easy thing to fix, quite honestly, that I think it's pretty smart to, get tested and to take supplement. Almost everyone, quite frankly, again, consult with your doctor, should probably be on vitamin D supplements as long as it's safe for them to do so, just because we don't live outside anymore and we don't work outside anymore. So almost everyone, quite frankly, needs it. And obviously, considering the trade-off in terms of skin damage and from sun exposure and skin cancer risk, supplementation, there's pros and cons of obviously doing it the natural way, but given that it saves your skin, I think, and you want to live to 80, 90 these days and not have skin cancer, it's a smart idea to focus more on supplementation than just, sitting outside excessively in the sun just to get vitamin D.
Just a quick question before I shut up. Do you see because I see kind of a correlation between in vitamin D deficiency, where because vitamin D primarily comes from fish, right?
In terms of a food-based source, but the primary production of it is going to come from the sun.
Because I see because it occurs so little in the population of Northern Europe and in Southern Europe, where fish is very, Italy and Norway, where I'm from.
Right.
It's sort of we're having a very Mediterranean diet,
right,
where fish is very, common, and where you see as the Middle Eastern countries where there aren't any fish, basically, it's up to 80%. So I think it's very regional based as well,
Yeah, obviously where you live in terms of, the sun exposure and, the food, the type of food. There's quite a bit of cultural differences in terms of seafood consumption. Although there are Middle Eastern countries, certainly, like around the Gulf region, who do absolutely consume fish as part of their diet. But, if now that you brought that up, you do get some vitamin D from fish. It's probably insufficient to get optimal levels of vitamin D. But if you prefer a more natural supplement, you can consume cod liver oil. Cod liver oil in particular is high in vitamin D and higher than, like even a fish oil supplement or just consuming fish. It's more concentrated essentially in the liver. And so when they extract and purify cod liver, it's high in vitamin D. So you obviously want to make sure you're consuming a good pure source of that. And checking the dosage of the vitamin D in the cod liver oil, and obviously testing your own levels to making sure that supplementing with that in conjunction with your doctor's approval is getting you to the vitamin D levels that you want to be. So thanks for mentioning the fish as well. I think that can obviously be an additional source of vitamin D, and cod liver oil supplements in particular can be helpful to get your levels to where you'd like them to be. All right, so I appreciate it, Matthew. I want to answer a question that was written in on Discord by Ryan O. He asked two questions. Do you have any tips or strategies for being a highly effective employee in the context of working in tech? I currently work in finance and I'm interviewing with tech firms to pivot into finance and strategy type roles. So I'm going to give he asked for a quick tip. So I have a very long answer about productivity because I'm a huge productivity guy. You can read my Twitter, by the way, at Dr. CamRx. That's DrCamRx. I talk a lot about performance optimization and productivity since I have a private practice coaching tech CEOs and VCs. But I recommend something very quick and easy for folks. I have an article. If you Google my name, Cameron Sapah, and the Keystone Habit, that's basically my personal productivity system. And the whole thesis around it is you can, in 4 minutes, plan the next 4 hours of your day. So you do this a couple times a day. You do this in the morning, around lunchtime, late afternoon, and at the end of the day. And you just set goals for what am I going to do for the next 4 hours. And the next time you do a Keystone Habit, you check in, did I do what I said I was going to do? If not, what got in the way and how can I iterate on improving that? So it's a continual improvement system. If you're familiar with sort of lean manufacturing from Toyota, the idea is you don't wait a week to fail on your goals before you go try again. You're checking in every 4 hours and making sure that you're not getting off track. And if you are, you can change your strategies or quite frankly, change your goals. So Keystone Habit I find very helpful for folks in terms of making progress towards your goals. My thesis is the reason that most people fail in terms of their behavior change goals is they don't have a system, they don't have a process in place to make sure that they're on track. Because I can give you a million recommendations about how to improve your productivity, but how do I know you're actually practicing them or you're making an effort towards them? We just forget, quite frankly, to do a lot of these things. You can read the best book about 7 habits of highly effective people. I can tell you, I know a lot of people who've read that book. They don't incorporate it into their lives because they don't have a system for doing so. And the Keystone Habit is a simple and effective system for being a highly effective person and professional. So that's my recommendation to Ryan, especially given he's working in tech. And then there's a second part to this question. What path would you suggest someone go down in terms of seeking clinical assistance for a previously diagnosed learning disability? I struggled with learning comprehension all throughout high school and received extended time on tests. Luckily, I was able to turn my life around through hard work. I transferred into a top 20 school, got good jobs, etc. But sometimes I still feel held back because I tend to be a slow learner. I've gotten nothing but good performance reviews at work, yet I'm still not progressing at the pace of some of my friends in their careers. Could a previously diagnosed learning disability possibly just be anxiety or OCD? Any advice is appreciated. Thanks. So first of all, what I would say is don't overly compare yourself to your peers. I think that's a great way of creating unhappiness and misery. And I think it's really tough, particularly if you're in a high-performing environment. You're going to look to your peers and, it's a natural thing to do. We are social creatures and we're attuned to where we are in the social hierarchy, as Jordan Peterson would say. But the problem is if you're in a very small bubble or circle, it can be very easy to compare yourself to a small population of people and feel bad about yourselves, right? Like I'll give you a personal example. I went to Harvard College. Mark Zuckerberg was literally my classmate. Every single person in my class of 1600 probably feels like a failure compared to Mark Zuckerberg because we're not worth $50 billion. There can only be one, as they say in the Highlander. So obviously, if you're basing yourself on social comparison to your peers, if your peer group obviously is in the top 1%, right? You don't sit there and appreciate the fact that you're doing well still compared to the 99% of the population. So I always tell people excessive social comparison is a recipe for unhappiness. So if you're doing well and you're telling me you're getting good performance reviews, and okay, so theoretically some of your friends are progressing faster, that's not a reason to feel bad about yourself. By definition, if you're average 50th percentile, 50% of people are going to do better than you. You may be above average. You could be 70th percentile, but 30% of your peers are still going to progress more quickly in their careers. So I always think, look, it's good to be ambitious. It's always good to strive for more, but it should generally be a little bit more intrinsic, right? Not because, Bob or Joe over there is beating me, but I'm still ahead of 80% of my peers. So I do think it's important to be attuned. You should be aware of where you are in your status hierarchy. You should be aware if you're last in your class because you're probably doing something wrong at that point. But you should use it more as calibration is the way that I put it, right? You want to know where you are compared to other people so you can kind of understand if you're doing it right. But in terms of where you should be going, you should base that on your own values and your own objectives in life, and not rely overly on extrinsic motivation. Now, the part of the other question was about sort of learning disabilities. It depends on what the learning disability is. It wasn't specified if it was ADHD or some reading comprehension issue that resulted in extra time. Look, and if you work for a large corporation, you actually can use that to get extra accommodation, right? So like certainly like people, for instance, with certain disabilities can have translators, if, for instance, if they're in the hard of hearing community, or have other sort of accommodations that can be helpful. Smaller corporations, it's going to be harder to get that kind of stuff, or you may not want to necessarily disclose that you have a learning disability. That's obviously up to you. But in terms of that, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to hold you back per se if you can come up with behavioral coping strategies to compensate for that, right? It may require that, you take more notes, that you go over things a couple times, that you spend some time before work prepping, in order to surmount some things that may come a little bit more naturally to other people. So in fact, if you look at the rates of, for instance, dyslexia and ADHD amongst successful entrepreneurs, they're much higher than general population. It doesn't mean it's easy to succeed if you have ADHD or dyslexia, but it also means it doesn't have to stop you. There's a lot of very, very successful entrepreneurs who, in fact, I would argue are successful because of those things, because they quite frankly wouldn't hold down a normal job. They're kind of unemployable because of their learning disabilities. But as an entrepreneur and having the right support and people around them, they're able to thrive, in fact, off of the sort of the chaos of startups and do very well. So I don't think it necessarily has to hold you back, but you may want to work with a licensed mental health professional, a psychologist who specializes in, let's say, learning disabilities, ADHD, or whatever the issue is that you're dealing with, to make sure that you're using the right behavioral coping strategies to compensate and surmount, quite frankly, whatever issue that you're facing. So it can be a hurdle, I would say, but hurdles can be jumped over if you have the right sort of attitude and the right resources to make sure that you can clear them. So great question, and great questions for today. We're coming up on time at 7:02. So shout out to everyone who asked really, really great questions today. You can catch us every single week on Clubhouse, YouTube, Instagram Live. We usually host this show Thursdays at 7 o'clock, so you can catch us in 8 days. And if you're interested in maximizing your testosterone, this show is sponsored by my company. It's MaximusTribe.com. If you are currently living in California and Florida, and you're an adult male over the age of 18 who's looking to improve their testosterone levels and increase their energy, their sex drive, their mood, their focus, and their work performance, which are all documented increases that we've seen in participants in our program, check us out at MaximusTribe.com. Until then, I'll catch you all later next Thursday at 6 o'clock, and have a wonderful and healthy week, everyone.